Thank you. All right, over to you, David.
Thank you, Esteban. Welcome all. It is my enormous pleasure to be conducting this conversation with a man whom I think we can probably recognize is the most significant cultural critique for music in the Anglophone world at the moment. Alex Ross is, as you well know, the music critic for The New Yorker and has been in that role for 25 years, pretty much as long as it took Wagner to write the Ringing Cycle. He has established himself as a fresh and exciting voice in the world of music reviewing, continuing a line that goes back to at least George Bernard Shaw and further in the Anglophone world, and continuing through people like Harold Schonberg and James Oysterich. Alex, I discovered when, like many of us, I read his first book, which is, of course, the well-known The Rest is Noise, which was also the title of his blog. And this was an amazingly insightful and exciting discovery for me of a lot of 20th century music I did not know. Alex has a knack of capturing the experience of music without resorting to too much technical language. And I think that's what's endeared him to music lovers around the planet, but also to professional musicologists like myself who envy his fluency with words. Then in 2010, a second book came out, also on my shelf, a collection of essays called Listen to This. And indeed, we did listen to Alex, as we have done so often, where he explored things outside the Western art music tradition as well as within it. I remember particularly a chapter on Radiohead. But of course, it is for his third book that we're all assembled today, all members of the Wagner Society in New South Wales. And this is his latest and so far longest book called Wagnerism, with a wonderful subtitle, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Alex has written so much other excellent criticism that many of us will have read. I remember being blown away by a very short piece he wrote on 10 bars of Wagner, 10 bars that I'd heard and never really considered before, some of which also makes its appearance, I'm glad to say, in the book itself. So I could keep on going for Wagnerian lengths on Alex's credentials, but I think we all know him. So let me start the conversation by saying, welcome, Alex. Thank you for coming here virtually and for speaking to us today.
Well, thank you so much, David, for that very, very generous, all too generous, but gratifying introduction. And it's a delight to be speaking to you, all of you in Australia, as well as New Zealand. Places that I've visited and had joyous experiences in. And I just wish I could be there in person, but perhaps one day soon.
We will hope for better times that will enable you to return. Alex, I thought I'd begin by just picking up on something which only came up in your postlude to the book, which is your own background as a Wagnerian. Somewhat to my surprise, you weren't a Wagnerian from youth. You had a later discovery of them. Can you just outline a little bit of your path to Wagner before writing this book?
Yeah, certainly. I was not really strongly devoted to Wagner when I was very young, it's true. I grew up in a household where my parents listened to classical music all the time. They weren't musicians, but they went to concerts, especially chamber music concerts, very regularly. And I took to it. They didn't really have to push me toward it. I took toward it of my own volition. And the music that I got to know first was the sort of Austro-German classical and romantic instrumental tradition. So it was really Haydn to Brahms, and that was the music that I got to know first and very well. And I was really not listening to opera per se, maybe a little bit of, my parents had a few recordings of Mozart, Verdi, Puccini, but I really didn't start listening and seeing opera until later. And no Wagner. There was absolutely no Wagner in my parents' pretty good sized record collection. It was just something that they seemed to have, if not an active aversion to, a sort of polite sort of silence on the subject of Wagner. And I remember, I have a distinct memory of going to the public library and checking out LPs of Lohengrin. I don't remember who's recording when I was I don't know, probably 10 years old, maybe 12, and trying to listen to it and just being completely at sea and just not being able to grasp what was going on, and the sort of lack of discrete motives and then sort of formal organization that I was used to in the sort of classical romantic repertoire was absent. And I just found it vaguely discomforting, and so really didn't do much in the way of trying to listen to Wagner, except for the Meistersinger Overture. I remember listening with satisfaction to the Meistersinger Overture, which of course is, much more classically oriented in this somewhat sort of ironic or singular Wagnerian way than the other operas. But it wasn't until college that I really returned to Wagner and began to explore him seriously. And even then, it was from a somewhat skeptical angle. I was very immersed in 19th, early 20th century European history, literature, cultural history, and wrote my thesis on James Joyce. And Wagner was kind of lurking there as an issue, a problem, a kind of relic, perhaps, for the early modern period. And yet I remember especially Tristan and Isolde, sort of starting listening to Tristan and sort of getting pulled in to Wagner's world. But it happened somewhat gradually. And it was really only when I was well into my 20s and was finally seeing opera live at the Met that it suddenly began to hit me exactly what Wagner was as a composer and as a theatrical, as a dramatist as well. And so it's been this sort of slow, steady, deepening immersion in Wagner, always with sort of questions lingering, but with a kind of growing fascination with every aspect of this phenomenon. And so I decided to write this book, which set aside to some extent Wagner himself and to look simply at his influence, especially in the arts and literature, which really was for me also a return to the kinds of topics that I was very immersed in college. There's a big section in the book on Joyce, and then that was my my undergraduate specialty, and so it was great fun for me to sort of reactivate all of those sort of literary sort of modes of our literary analysis. And I've done literary criticism, in the New Yorker, but this sort of delved a little deeper.
Great. I mean, what I'm clearly getting is the fact that unlike, say, the great Wagner scholar Derek Cook, you wouldn't describe yourself as a Wagnerolator. You always had this kind of distance or awareness of the complications of Wagner's reception. And this, of course, comes out very, very strongly in aspects of the book. Since you chose as your subtitle the word shadow, of course, again, that I think highlights to some extent the darker aspects of Wagner, though of course you're very generous about celebrating the good things, the reason why we continue to listen to and continue to engage with him. Esteban, I was wondering if I could ask you just to put up the one slide I asked you just to for a moment, just to let people see. Because one thing that I find in your book, Alex, capacious and enormous though it is, I think it's about 670 pages before you even get to the notes. There's one aspect of art that you deliberately don't deal with, and that is, ironically, music. In other words, the musical reception of Wagner is something you've quite deliberately left to one side, despite your capacious study of Wagner's impact on the other arts. And I just thought, since you had the word shadow, it called to mind this cartoon that appeared pretty much on the 30th anniversary of Wagner's death, a little later in the year, but around his birth date. And you can see Strauss, Richard Strauss, that's the German pun for ostrich, is the word for Strauss, sitting on his egg, so it's Electra, Ariadne, and Salome, his operas that he's hatching out, and saying, nothing really wants to come out of my eggs. I believe that can be also a much ruder German word, but we'll leave that. And as you can see, he's sitting in a shadow. And if you look closely on the screens, you can probably just make out the shadow of Der Meister himself there. So that's just one, of course, visual representation of how significant Wagner's shadow was on music. Can you just discuss why you deliberately perhaps decided not to treat that topic?
Yes, well, first of all, my first book, The Rest is Noise, a fair amount of that book treats the topic of composers in the shadow of Wagner, beginning on the very first page with Richard Strauss. And, I began in 1900, I began with Strauss and Mahler there, both of whom are unimaginable without Wagner. You know, they are creatures of the Wagnerian universe in so many ways. Strauss even more than Mahler, I would say. And so, you know, I had already gone into that aspect of the influence, as well as Wagner and Debussy, Wagner in the Second Viennese School, and then later in the book I talk about Wagner in Nazi Germany, which I actually wish that I hadn't gone into quite so much detail there, because I sort of went over the same ground in this book as well. But and so I just didn't want to repeat myself, first of all. And secondly, I think it is the influence outside of music, the shadow of Wagner extending outside of music. This is what really makes the phenomenon so interesting and so singular, because, you know, every major composer of Western musical history has had extensive influence that is sort of stretched beyond their deaths and you know, across the centuries, whether it's Josquin or Monteverdi, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and on and on. And you know, Wagner was similarly influential. I don't think ultimately in musical terms he was any more influential than Bach. Less so, perhaps, if you just consider how Bach is just the ultimate starting point for sort of for every new generation of composers that comes along, including Steve Reich and, you know, many young composers today. And whereas, you know, what happened with Wagner in the arts and in literature, as well as sort of political history, intellectual history, nothing quite like this had happened before. And so I felt as though there was a sort of good reason to take it on, to try to take all of it on, you know, in a single book, because while there have been any number of brilliant studies of one aspect or another of what we call Wagnerism, no one had ever been foolish enough to try to do everything in one book, as far as I can tell. It's such a book has never really been attempted, and you know, some ways into the project, I began to realize why no one had tried to do this. And I only do, you know, honestly, I only do part of it. You know, I mean, there's just so much that is left unsaid, you know, in this book and uncovered. But nonetheless, it was an extraordinary phenomenon, and it was one that sort of faded from sight, especially sort of in the popular perception of Wagner. I think those of us who really live with Wagner and have explored this literature, you know, are very well aware of Wagner's impact on the symbolists in France, on Anglo-American modernism, on sort of early abstract painting, on theater history, on film. But for a lot of other people out there, sort of generally cultured people out there, their image of Wagner, their conception of Wagner is dominated by the political problem, by the Nazi association, to such a degree that it comes as a surprise to realize that Wagner was such an enormous force for late 19th century avant-garde French poets and painters, or that Willa Cather was enormously involved in Wagner's work, or Virginia Woolf in a somewhat more skeptical mode. And so I thought this would be revealing, you know, to that broader audience, to show the extent of that phenomenon and use it, I think, to counterbalance this strenuous emphasis on Wagner's role as a sort of progenitor or sort of forerunner of Nazi ideology, which is both very important to discuss, is sort of by no means an invention or a fiction. It's an absolutely serious issue, and one that I think Wagnerians were reluctant to look at for a long time. But the degree to which it sort of occupies, dominates the discussion of Wagner has become excessive, you know, and so this book was really designed to redress the balance somewhat, without losing sight of that central problem, which really comes to the fore later in the book in a way that maybe makes it all the more dismaying. You know, once we've experienced all these other aspects, more positive aspects of Wagner's influence, to have this rear its head and sort of come to occupy the center of the picture, it has a sort of tragic heft to it, and you just can't ignore how Wagner himself brought it on himself to some extent, and so kind of this formulation of Thomas Mann that I mentioned several times in the book, I found extraordinarily helpful, where he says that Wagner lent a hand to his own misuse, which is sort of, for me, it sort of gets absolutely to the core of it. Wagner was misused in Nazi Germany, unquestionably, but he participated in this distortion. He sort of gave opportunities for this distortion, and so I find that a very, very powerful, concise formulation, and also completely ambivalent one.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose those words could potentially also be said of someone else who was appropriated by the Nazis and Wagner's agon, as you well describe it, Nietzsche. In a way, by certain aspects of his philosophy, he's already, enabling himself to be appropriated by a later regime there. But before we get to the Nazis, I think I want to take some aspects of your book in order there. But again, I also would like just to say, you do say that Wagner is unique in his impact on the other arts. And that got me thinking, what other great composers would have also had impacts outside themselves? And I could think of a few artists responding to Beethoven, from Tolstoy and Klimt, etc., and then Mozart as well. But there really is, I quickly came to the conclusion that, Wagner is in a way unique. Now, do you see this as a property of the time in which he was writing and the time that followed, that explosion of very different movements, or a response to something inherent in the works themselves? In other words, it's probably a bit of both, let's be honest. But in other words, is Wagner the cause, or is it the fact that he appears at the right time? He's a timely man for an explosion of modernist development.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important question, and it's one that I feel as though I never quite gave a satisfactory answer to in the book, but I'm not sure there is, a satisfactory answer. Why did this happen? Why did this kind of volcano of sort of, artistic kind of responses erupt, metaphor, but you get the idea. And it hadn't really happened in musical history before, as much as, so many figures outside of music paid attention to Bach and Beethoven and all the others. And I don't think it's happened since, even when you look at Bob Dylan or the Beatles as sort of the most gigantic phenomena of pop music history, there's nothing equivalent to what happened with Wagner. This, not only the fact that so many people were listening to him, but that he helped to impel, or seemed to impel, the formation of artistic movements, especially symbolism, but also in a more complicated and elusive way, modernism, and the sort of emergence of film as a genre, as an art form is somehow kind of inseparable from Wagner in various other ways. He was so pivotal, and so why did it happen? And yes, I think it was very much the moment that he came along, especially after 1848. After the failure of the revolutions, the sort of growing sense that a transformation of society could perhaps not be brought about directly, at least for the time being, through political means, but perhaps it could be brought about sort of artistically or spiritually. So this idea that sort of artists could be the leading edge of a sort of transformation of the world was one that people became increasingly attached to. And it was sort of this religion of art, the sense that sort of artists could be saviors and sort of world revolutionaries. And Wagner just offered himself as sort of the ultimate example of that capacity in a way that sort of many people found very convincing. And then there were sort of generations of artists after him who wanted to surpass him, who wanted to sort of do something even more extraordinary in terms of sort of upending civilization and sort of bringing about some kind of sort of total revolution and metamorphosis. And so, yeah, he was perfectly timed. But, ultimately, I think it does sort of come out of his own artistic capacities. I think the double capacity for words and music was exceedingly powerful, and that has also, that was something essentially new in musical history, and one that was never quite successfully replicated after him. He was such a potent dramatist, and this sort of gets to this question of what is his value as literature? And of course, there's been so much criticism of Wagner's language. And when you just look at it on the page, it is certainly extremely awkward and it's sort of like fingernails on the chalkboard to a lot of native German speakers, because it's a very strange version of the German language. But in fusion with the music, it is amazingly powerful. Just the way he structures acts, the sort of sense of this continuity of action. The three acts of just especially sort of unfolding in real time, but Valkyria too, and the sense that you are just disappearing into this theatrical world, and it is happening to you in real time. And then the way the music, of course, intensifies that spell, or really perhaps creates that spell from the very beginning. The Wagner spell, the sound of the orchestra, the nature of his orchestration, the breaking down of operatic forms into this stream of action and the stream of consciousness, in the sense that the unconscious is some sort of rising to the surface as all this is happening. It was extraordinary to audiences of the period and to artists of the period, and so they were quite in awe. If you just look at how Baudelaire responds to Wagner, and he's just beside himself, he's stupefied, and he's just enormously admiring of the artist who could reduce them to such a state of stupefaction, and he sort of elevates that sensation to sort of the goal of art for coming generations, and so many artists in the sort of proto-modernist and modernist tradition sort of pursue exactly that effect.
I was also hugely struck by, you've mentioned Baudelaire there, and in a way he is, if you like, the avatar of the French reception of Wagner. But from the early chapters of your book, it was brought home to me as never before just how different national traditions of Wagner reception could be. So he takes on this sort of decadent allure for the French there. The Germans seem to sort of regard them as, cultural property. And I think you later go on to say the modernists kind of steered away from him because he was that hegemonic within the culture there. In America, if I recall rightly, it was largely seen in the sort of the exciting uplift of buildings in the city and how they could be seen as Wagnerian. So in a way, they're all finding something very different in the art. Could you maybe comment a little bit on that, and maybe what it is that is of Wagner that might be seen as core, if there is anything, or does it dissolve into these different reception traditions?
Yeah. Well, it is so varied, and you do have this sort of fundamental effect where, and you can just see this in the case of Baudelaire. At first encounter, the listener, the spectator, seems to be overwhelmed. And Wagner is this dominating force who pins down the spectator and sort of subjects the spectator to this world that Wagner has created. And yet, the end result of this experience for so many, especially these strong personalities, is to emerge with an idea of Wagner which is very much the spectators. And the spectators is not kind of been stamped or sort of branded with kind of this Wagnerian identity and proceeds to sort of parrot, everything that Wagner thinks and says and believes, but it's sort of quite the opposite. Wagner is reduced. It is sort of Wagner who submits to the sort of the strong personality of the spectator. So you immediately get this proliferation of different understandings of Wagner in the different national traditions, and then just among each of these personalities with strong ideas about what Wagner means, or just how Wagner can be used. And so it becomes this mirror of itself. And this is very complex and interesting. And I think it happens in every case, especially when an artwork sort of survives its initial moment and begins sort of moving through time and sort of moving across space. And so the the image proliferates. I mean, just look at what happened with Shakespeare and the sort of the many different Shakespeares, the German Shakespeare and the American Shakespeare, and the same with Wagner. But it's somehow even more intense with Wagner. This mirroring effect is stronger, and so why does that happen is another kind of big question that that I don't have a sort of a precise answer for. But I think it is this ingenious combination in Wagner of power and vagueness, or sort of power and ambiguity, and so it's so sensually potent and so sort of immediately gripping. But ultimately there's great confusion, and I think to some degree deliberate confusion on Wagner's part about what all this actually means. And you've got the reams and reams of writing of sort of Wagner's commentaries, but those sort of often contradict each other, and also can sort of contradict the work itself, or can just be completely disregarded, by the spectator as the sort of spectator experiences the work. But but he articulates the core philosophy very succinctly, uncharacteristically succinctly, when he talks about myth, and when he talks about sort of the power of myth to endure for all time, because it is always sort of taking new life in sort of each new context. And the sort of the story of myth is he uses this, I can't remember the exact words in German, but it's this locution where he talks about compressed, sort of extremely compressed form, just somehow you get this idea of sort of this super compact, almost like sort of this atomic, kind of core, which is sort of under pressure, and then sort of releases this energy. And so that, I think he was conscious. He knew exactly what he was doing, when he manipulated myth. And I think that, that virtuosity of the manipulation of myth and the modernization of myth, this is also very much, I think, at the core of why this entire phenomenon happened, and why it continues to unfold, because we just know the power of myth to just be adapted in every circumstance, and every kind of society, every tradition, every individual can sort of see itself, themselves in these mythic, ancient, enduring mythic stories.
Absolutely. I'm also just in that, yes, this idea that Wagner became sort of omnipresent in culture is something you delineate wonderfully well in the, let's say, last decades of the 19th, first decade and a half of the 20th century. I was struck by two examples, which I'd just like to invite you to comment further on, where in a way you feel that Wagner doesn't have to be imbibed directly for the source, or indeed at all, for people to begin to find Wagner in you, or for you to feel Wagnerized. So the first example was of my countryman, W.B. Yeats, whom you say, yeah, he was just mixing in such circles that were themselves imbued with Wagnerism, that, he kind of had, acquired a certain sort of fluency with certain of the concepts there. And then even more startling for me was Walt Whitman, who, when he's talking about Leaves of Grass, he says, so many of my friends have compared it to the Gesamtkunstwerk. I guess there must be something in it. But if I recall correctly, he didn't actually engage with Wagner himself, except through this reception of his works there. This just suggests a phenomenon that's metastasizing so much that it's almost inescapable, even if you yourself are not conscious of an influence.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fascinating, and that's why I'm in the book. I'm not just talking about direct influence, although the sort of essential, sort of the spine of the book is very much these cases of artists, writers, and so on, who did seriously engage with Wagner and who knew the work very well. And this includes Willa Cather, Thomas Mann, of course, Virginia Woolf, actually, even though she was in so many ways a Wagner skeptic, and Joyce. And they knew the work. They were fluent in the work, and you can find quite minute references to the work in their own writing. And in this case, these are all writers. But there are all these other cases where it's not a case of direct influence. In some cases, it can be this resemblance which is just fascinating. And so that's the case with Whitman. There are these resemblances. There was no direct influence at all from Wagner to Whitman, but somehow in Whitman you find sort of these sort of strands, same strand surfacing as you see in Wagner, and that was very significant for his younger followers, especially in order to kind of position Whitman on a more international stage and to sort of see him kind of in conversation with, or sort of in the sort of duality with Wagner. It sort of helped to sort of broaden Whitman's meaning at that particular historical moment. And then Yeats is sort of this more kind of somewhat amusing case of someone who yes, was just as the only actual instance of Yeats sitting through a Wagner opera that I could find was Parsifal in New York, actually at the end of 1903 or early 1904. Other than that, I couldn't find a record of Yeats actually going to Wagner, but it was around, and Lady Gregory and Edward Martin and sort of others around him knew Wagner extremely well, and so he just absorbed it and either echoed it or used it to kind of buttress his own kind of independent ideas, about theater or about poetry, and just by making Wagnerian references. And so, yeah, it's influence, it's resemblance, it's sort of resonance and reverberation, and it takes so many different forms to the point where it can just become, if you look at anything from this period hard enough, there's going to be some Wagner in it, and then it could just turn into sort of total chaos, and this is why I left a lot out of the book, and maybe I should have left out more. I don't know. It is a very long book, but I just wanted to get into the texture of that phenomenon as much as I could.
I think you are very wisely cautious about this juggernaut absorbing everything. So yes, when I was reading it, I was saying, yes, here you're just definitely claiming analogies. Here you're claiming a line of descent there. What is also fascinating, of course, by virtue of the scope that you looked at, and I think early on you talk about the fact that Wagner has this effect on the artists of silence. In other words, it's always going to be to some extent a translation. It's not in the way that a musician has to actually wrestle with the same materials that Wagner does. And it was just, I was going through it and looking at all the different innovations that can be at least traced back to Wagner. For example, you say that Manet's turn to abstraction was in a response to Baudelaire responding to Wagner. You talk about Plantin's aesthetic of vagueness, again, linking back to Bayreuth's stage steam, etc. Serra's black frames for his canvases, like the dramatic blackouts of Wagner. So in all cases, you are getting artists who are stimulated to do things in their own medium, but we can still see it as traceable back to the things that Wagner's doing in his stage works.
Yeah, or it's not necessarily the case that Serra, say, would not have had a particular idea without having experienced Wagner, but especially with that generation, it was sort of Wagner gave them confidence. So sort of Wagner, you could cite Wagner and sort of have this support. And so that was very often what was happening with the painters, especially. Van Gogh and Gauguin, Cézanne, they would have painted what they painted, I think, without ever having heard a note of Wagner. But they found Wagner a kind of heartening example of what I call in the book a successful avant-garde. So sort of, Wagner was an extremely daring and provocative artist who broke through, who found his audience, and sort of created his own establishment outside of the Extant establishment, and that was sort of enormously inspiring, I think, for that generation of artists. But I think that there are other cases where there is sort of a direct impact that can be traced, and these sort of responses by analogy are fascinating to me, because it is always going to be inexact, especially with the writers. And I was wary sometimes of talking about, say, leitmotifs in literature. There's been a lot of this in sort of literary analysis for generations. And when you get to the point of saying that sort of repeating the same phrase a number of times in a book is a sort of sign of Wagnerian influence, it almost sort of gets it sort of completely back to front. because Wagner's idea of the leitmotif was to a great extent sort of derived from literature itself. You know, it was a sort of literary device being brought into music. I think Eric Prieto makes that point. And so you don't want to get too carried away. I was wary of leitmotif, and I was very wary of Gesamtkunstwerk, because this word has been sort of thrown around endlessly, and in a way that ultimately doesn't have a great deal to do with Wagner's own practice. Wagner himself only used the word on 5 occasions in the 2 essays, Artwork of the Future and Art and Revolution, and then really lost interest in the idea. There's even signs that he began to be irritated by the fact that everyone started talking about Gesamt this and Gesamt that, as he said in a letter to Liszt, genug davon, enough of this. But it took off, you know, and so it sort of took on a life of its own, which is an interesting topic in itself. You know, even if people's Gesamtkunstwerke had nothing to do with Wagner, the fact that they felt the need to use the word and sort of allude to Wagner kind of does tell you something. But again, it can just be applied to anything, you know, and so I only wanted to kind of discuss, you know, say leitmotif in literature when there's sort of a really strong evidence, as with Thomas Mann, that it was being used with Wagnerian intent. And Proust as well. I think very, very important, the connection between leitmotif technique and Proust's epiphanies and his sort of recurring figures, and Joyce as well. So it can be dangerous, you know, to sort of pursue some of these analogies too far, but it's the vagueness of it and the kind of inexactness of it, the approximate kind of nature of this influence is fascinating, because it's just so interesting to watch arts in conversation with each other. And the joy of working on this book was to be able to talk about all of the arts with varying degrees of competence on my part, but always with this excitement that's sort of seeing the disciplines intersecting and kind of breaking out of their specialized vocabularies. And I have to say, reading the work of so many scholars who I cite throughout the book, who were so important to me, themselves coming from all different disciplines and sort of creating this zone. The historian Celia Applegate talks about the Wagnerian Schengen zone, where you can sort of trade freely, sort of, you know, across the lines of your discipline, history, literature, music, art history, and so on and so forth. And that's just an exhilarating space to inhabit. And I think one of the great positive legacies that Wagner left is to have created such a zone just by being such a sort of triumphant dilettante, you know, as Nietzsche somewhat mean-spiritedly said.
I was thinking about the arc of a normal sort of like composer's impact felt towards the end of their life, perhaps if they've established themselves for a period after their death, and then eventually new things come along. It becomes less relevant to make them a reference point. I mean, Beethoven, on his influence on the German symphony, might be a bit of an exception because he had quite a long shadow or a long afterlife. And it's several times in the book, as early, I think, first of all, at around about page 350, you say, World War I marked the end of Wagner as an intellectual phenomenon, that his heyday had effectively passed. And yet at page 350, we're barely halfway through the book at this particular point. So we've got a very long sort of second bounce of Wagnerian influence. Can you perhaps just sort of say why it is that he's had this much longer shadow? Is it because he gets more and more mistranslated? Is it sadly because of his huge impact or perceived impact on the Third Reich, etc., has given this idea of Wagner's relevance a longer history than it would otherwise have had?
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't actually sort of thought of it in precisely those terms, this sort of second bounce and the question of what role did 20th century history, German history, play in that sort of second wave of Wagnerism, and I think it played a very big role. There was this kind of golden age of sort of fin de siècle of Wagnerism, where he is just saturating everything, and there's this enthusiasm for Wagner, which often becomes absurd. And I have to say, I enjoyed the absurdity of some of these efflorescences of Wagnerism, and I hope readers can enjoy it too when you get to Joséphin Péladan and Rosicrucian Wagnerism and some of the sort of outer reaches of Wagnerian occultism, and it's great fun, and it's just part of the sort of decadent aesthetic madness of the fin de siècle. But it does come to a violent end in 1914. I think the way I began the 9th chapter of the book is with Parsifal entering into the international repertory on the first day of 1914 when the copyright expires. And this is the pinnacle. The fact that sort of one city after another is sort of mounting productions of Parsifal one after another. And it's just coming right after the centenary in 1913. So this is the peak. And the famous Barcelona Parsifal that begins at 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve, because there's an hour time difference at that time between Spain and Germany. And so it was midnight German time, and they could begin their performance. It actually began even a little earlier than that. And so there's this crest, but then World War I, first of all, just brings performance culture kind of screeching to a halt in so many ways. But also this is the time at which Wagner begins to be so heavily identified with German nationalism and German militarism that it sort of eats away at his capacity to be a sort of purely kind of cosmopolitan presence. So he gets nationalized in Germany, and the sort of image of him outside of Germany is colored by that, as well as I think just the change of mores. The sort of beginning of the age of recording and the sort of rise of pop music and the kind of culture that comes after the First World War, the discarding of everything heavy and romantic and sort of bourgeois art, and sort of Wagner gets to sort of thrown away with that to some extent. But then it does sort of start to sort of all kind of happen again. I mean, sometimes in just more oblique ways, where sort of Wagner is still working behind the scenes of modernism in the 1920s. When I write about Ulysses' The Wasteland and Virginia Woolf's The Waves in film, as film is just becoming, taking flight as an art form, and Wagner is so much part of it. So I think there's a strong second wave of Wagnerism there. But yes, I think, especially once you get to the Second World War, to sort of the Nazi period, Wagner becomes interesting again in a much darker way, because he emblematizes the danger of art, the capacity of art to be politicized and weaponized. He becomes a symbol for the dark side of this entire bourgeois culture of the 19th century, which is sort of absorbed into the kind of dead aesthetics of totalitarian regimes, and sort of this question of how did Wagner's anti-Semitism actually affect Nazi ideology, and his sort of chauvinism, to what degree did that actively form Nazi ideology. Sort of all of that, it does make Wagner interesting again in this very shadowy and this very dark way. But in a way that I think post-war artists sort of turn to Wagner as this wounded giant, of artistic history, and the way Wagner is represented in Anselm Kiefer's paintings, and in Louis Buñuel's films, and in the novels of Philip K. Dick, and so it's a new form of Wagnerism. It's much less widespread than it was before, but it's notable. It's these are some major artists of the late 20th century that we're talking about, and so the impact remains strong.
When it comes to the Second World War, I mean, you just described there, after 1914, Wagner got nationalized. And, still more so, you could say that the idea of Wagner is nationalized, particularly post-World War II. But you point out a few very interesting things about it. First of all, reception-wise, during the war, performances of Wagner went up in the US and down in Germany, which is definitely counterintuitive. And then secondly, without giving Wagner in any way an alibi, you've already quoted Thomas Mann's great line on this. You do talk about the fact that Wagner served the Nazi state only when he was shorn of his ambiguities. And if your book up to that point has done anything, it has shown that Wagner is very ambiguous in his reception there.
What is Wagner without his ambiguities? Yeah.
Exactly. So in other words, particularly since you wrestled with these ideas, and I can remember also in his Wagner and Me, Stephen Fry also wrestling with this particular idea of the Wagner appropriation by the Nazis. Do you feel that Wagner provides enough resistance for you to be able to enjoy him, if not in an uncomplicated fashion, at least without sort of, having this dark, dark shadow omnipresent in your listening or your watching experience?
Yeah. Oh no, he certainly does. Because the ambiguity is so central to what Wagner does. The fact that the ring itself is this gigantic exercise in the critique of power, undeniably, and Parsifal is in the same way or in a different way. Tristan is a work whose political implications are quite minimal. Tristan is like always the refuge for people who want to enjoy Wagner without being kind of oppressed by sort of all of these problems. But I think the entirety of the work, Meistersinger is the work where I feel the politics is sort of most to the surface, and the one where I just sometimes struggle to sort of maintain my concentration, on the work itself and on its imaginative world, especially at the end, and the ending is really catastrophic in some ways. I think many people would disagree with this, and there are sort of strong defenses of Meistersinger, but I do think Carol Berger was right in saying that Wagner severely wounded his own work in a way that no artist may have ever wounded his own work when he rewrote the ending and put in the Hauptact material and so blatantly politicized the work to a degree that distorts the character of Hans Sachs, in my opinion. As I say, there are people who sort of counter that and can do it in quite eloquent ways, and you can perform the opera and present Hans Sachs, I think, in a way that evades these issues. But it's there. So that's the work where I honestly get nervous every time it's played. But the rest of the work, I mean, yeah, just it's open to so many different interpretations, and there's so many sort of aspects of the work itself and of Wagner's writings, political writings that are outside of Nazi ideology and that sort of directly contradict Nazi ideology, as the Nazis knew, because he was not uncontroversial, and there were some Nazis who found him to be at best useless and in some ways harmful. In terms of especially the religiosity of Parsifal, the sort of praise of compassion as a virtue in Parsifal was something that the Nazis had to explicitly contradict. They actually had to do it with Meistersinger too. When Meistersinger was presented during the war, there was sort of this listening guide for the soldiers who, as many of you know, were shipped en masse to Bayreuth for these performances, and they were specifically instructed. The idea that we can put faith in holy German art to sort of carry on the sort of pure soul of Germany in the absence of a political Germany. It's just no. We need force. We need the German sword. And so they're just specific stumbling blocks, for the Nazi reception of Wagner, and some Nazis consider him to be quite questionable. And the sort of the cult of Wagner in Nazi Germany relied so much on Hitler's own fandom. And I do think ultimately Hitler was more a kind of helpless fan of the work than any kind of student of the work, or somehow sort of receiving some kind of meaning and instruction for the work that he was applying in the political realm. I think that Wagner's political influence on Hitler was relatively small. And one telling bit of evidence is that Hitler never once quoted Wagner's anti-Semitic writings. He never even alluded to Wagner being an anti-Semite, as far as we can tell. And that's strange. It doesn't mean, of course, he knew that Wagner was anti-Semite, and I'm sure he read Jewish music, but he didn't find it useful for his purposes to bring Wagner into that part of the discussion. And Wagner was more useful to him as this generally grand symbol of German cultural might. And when it came to the specifics of sort of anti-Semitic language, there were other examples that he could draw on, or his own rhetoric, which was a more effective sort of weapon in his mind. So, there's these sort of points of difference and sort of points of separation. I don't want to get too carried away by this and just sort of start sort of painting Wagner as a force of resistance in Nazi Germany. He certainly wasn't, but he does stand somewhat apart from Nazi ideology in my mind, and in a way that it's simply not essential that every bar of his work somehow be that you first have to sort of kind of look at it through this lens of sort of the Nazi aftermath, and sort of deal with that. We can, and just as human beings, as spectators, we can have all this in mind, and we can at the same time lose ourselves in the work for several hours. And it's not as if our memory of the horror of the Holocaust has been, obliterated as a result. We're able to sort of experiencing things on different levels. And I think it's part of the power of Wagner that now his work carries this enormous and dark history with it and allows us to contemplate that history, in the way that certain productions confront us with German history in a way that some Wagnerians don't like, I know. But I think it has made him just all the more potent as a theatrical force in a way that's almost perverse. But it is part of the reason why Wagner remains so somehow alive and controversial and sort of unresolved now. Sort of just has to do with this political history as well as cultural history.
Absolutely. I must say, citing Meistersinger is inevitable, I think, in these sorts of discussions. And I notice in one part of your book, you do mention various productions that have engaged with this problematic history, I think ending with Katharina Wagner's one. You didn't actually mention, even though technically I think it would have been out and you would of course have known of it, is Barry Kosky's one, which I think is one of the most successful in both not evading the problem, but also giving me at least a solution that by the end, I feel quite comfortable with that. In other words, there is a way of redeeming this particular work from its tangled history. And that also, of course, brings in a little Wagnerian reception of, Australian reception of Wagner into the thing, which otherwise, of course, managed to get to. I'm conscious of the time here, and I'd love you to get a chance to respond to perhaps some audience questions. So can I invite any people who would like to ask Alex a question there? And if you click on the reaction button and raise your hand, Esteban will be able to call on you in turn. Unfortunately, I don't have the access to the person who has the raised hand sort of permission button. So if you're interested in doing that, or else simply raise your hand visibly on the screen and I'll try and call on you if I can see you as well.
I've actually got a question on the chat, which is somewhat I guess controversial, but also timely given what's happening at the moment. But it might open a can of words where we might actually be talking for the next hour or so. But I'll ask it anyway. So this is from Robert Henderson saying, and I'm reading here, under the hero worshipping of Wagner, it comes as an embarrassment to some that Wagner loved cross-dressing and his son and grandson were gay. I'm not sure about the grandson. So much so, I was shocked that Wolfgang destroyed every set and drawing of his brother's productions. Again, I'm not sure about that. Can you talk a bit about homophobia in Wagnerism?
Well, it's a really interesting topic. I have sort of half a chapter on the topic, specifically gay Wagnerism, in the book, which is just like one of these cases where Wagner was actually quite progressive and not at all reactionary. I think he was well in the vanguard of people of his time who looked sympathetically on gay and lesbian people, or actually really specifically gay men. He welcomed them into his circle. Paul von Yukovsky was welcome with his young Italian boyfriend Peppino. And there's a wonderful passage in the diaries where Cosima says something mocking about this relationship. And Wagner says, it is something for which I have no experience but sympathy. I'm getting it slightly wrong. But you know, the idea that he understands, he is not gay himself, but that he understands it. He is sympathetic to it, and so he's quite progressive in this way, and Bayreuth became something of a mecca for gay people toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. It was known as a place where, if you were gay, you could be somewhat more comfortable and somewhat more open. The great early German gay rights activist and theorist of sexuality, Magnus Hirschfeld, explicitly commented on this aspect of Bayreuth and its welcoming atmosphere. And then there were critiques, there were attacks on Wagner as a kind of gay cult, and quite openly in the German press, back and forth. And I think ultimately Thomas Mann in Death in Venice, the question of Wagnerian homosexuality is very much behind Death in Venice, even if Wagner himself is not a named topic in the book, as well as many other places in Thomas Mann. And so yeah, Wagner was progressive. His work, Bayreuth itself, was seen as welcoming, and therefore there was also a homophobic response to Wagner and to Wagnerians, and to be sort of too enamored of Wagner was suspect, I think, especially for men. Nietzsche launches this attack on Wagner. He basically paints the Wagnerian youths, male youths, as demasculinized. You know, they're sort of submitting to Wagner in a way that can be sort of understood in a sexual sense. And so this goes on. This is sort of part of the reception of Wagner and his I don't know if we can explicitly call it cross-dressing, but he did, you know, he didn't sort of present himself outwardly to the world in kind of female garb, but he did sort of swathe himself in these sort of silken garments, as we all knew, in private. And this got out in the most embarrassing way in 1877, when Daniel Spitzer in Vienna published Wagner's correspondence with his milliner, the Putzmacherin correspondence. And this is one of the moments in which the Wagners were talking about going to America. I think possibly in part because of this hugely embarrassing episode. But then, you know, Hirschfeld again turns and says, no, this actually makes Wagner interesting. This complicates his artistic persona. This sort of gender ambiguity. This is something we should prize in him. And I think much later now in history, there are sort of serious and sympathetic kind of engagements with Wagner's sort of somewhat off-center sexuality. And you can see that in productions, you can see that in sort of interpretation and scholarship, such as Lawrence Dreyfus's wonderful book, Wagner and the Erotic Impulse, which was a big inspiration for me. And this sort of tradition of gay Wagnerism goes on. David Hockney and various others. And so this is a strand of Wagnerism, which is, it is much less troubled, I think, you know, than some of the other strands. And I've never heard of any talk of the grandsons being gay, but certainly Siegfried was part of the gay atmosphere at Bayreuth at the turn of the century.
There's another chat question. This is a more general one. And I read, I came to Wagner through Tolkien and heavy metal. I won't ask about metal, but could you talk a little about Tolkien, myth, and popular culture?
Oh, yes. Well, sort of myth and popular culture and kind of fantasy culture becomes a big topic at the end of the book. The last two chapters are Wagner and Hollywood, and then the final chapter has a big section on fantasy culture, which is where I get into Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And so this is part of why Wagner, I think, has remained alive and why Wagnerism has remained alive. His powerful presence in the movies from the very beginning as a model for film composers, but also this emergence of these kind of myth-based or semi-mythic action, adventure, fantasy genres. Very often modeled on Wagner or somehow indebted to Wagner more indirectly. With Tolkien, the debt is very obvious. It's right on the surface. There's been controversy over the years about whether Tolkien himself actively denied this influence from Wagner, and the famous quotation from a letter is, both rings were round and the resemblance ends. But Renee Vink has written a fascinating book on Wagner and Tolkien that sort of kind of moves beyond that endlessly repeated single quotation and reveals that Tolkien wasn't necessarily dismissive of Wagner. He went to see performances. He knew the work, and it's just very much there, as an influence on him. Even as he evolved his own, he used all of this mythic apparatus to his own ends, and so he's in no way an imitator of Wagner. He had his own idea of how these myths should unfold, but there are aspects of Tolkien's of the Lord of the Rings that come from Wagner and nowhere else, and the ring above all, because there's just no other ring in myth that has the kinds of properties that Wagner gives to it, where it sort of gives the wearer ultimate power, but it also corrupts the wearer, and it is cursed and ultimately sort of brings the wearer of the ring down. Lord of the Rings, the slave of the ring, as Alberic sings in Rheingold. And so that's very clear. But then, then you get into the later manifestations of sort of comic book heroes and Star Wars and the Matrix movies, Game of Thrones, the sort of TV show. And there are a lot of, these are more, I think, resemblances than influences, as to sort of use that distinction that I mentioned before, or sort of second, third, fourth hand kind of Wagnerism, to the point where it's a lineage. It's this kind of this long kind of circuitous lineage. It's not a case of Wagner having a direct impact, but it's fascinating, and it just always turning up. New examples are turning up all the time in the sort of this endless stream of Marvel Comics movies and DC Comics movies and all the other kind of forms of fantasy culture.
There's nothing else on chat, and I don't see anybody's hand up, so I might just be mindful of time, throw it open if anybody has a burning question or comment that they might want to pose. Use your chance. Ooh, Ardi, yes, Ardi's got his hand up.
Thanks for that really interesting conversation. I have a question that kind of brings together two different strands of conversation. I think on one hand, we all acknowledge how multifaceted Wagner is. And when we look at him, we can judge his impact in terms of his music, his libretto, his political writings and whatnot. And at one point, you mentioned the sort of common idea that Tristan is his least political work and offers a kind of refuge. I recently read this chapter by Mark Weiner in the Oxford Handbook of Opera, and he sort of completely challenged that idea, suggesting that in some of his writings, you can kind of see that for Wagner to express the ultimate political message, it needs to be concealed, that it can't be too overt kind of thing. And I think just a general sort of thing for contemplation, just to see what you think about it, how we go about judging these things, where what if the concealment is the point? And we can never be too comfortable with, oh, there's nothing explicit, it's not Meistersinger, but actually maybe at that point we're so within his sort of worldview or whatnot.
Yeah, well, there's nothing that Wagner ever created or wrote that was not political, So the fact that it seems as though sort of Tristan is a political opera can certainly be deceptive, and I'm aware of Mark Weiner's commentary and several others who do see Tristan as a political opera, and those are very interesting and valid interpretations. The issue, I think, is that when you're sort of talking about such a kind of concealed message, I always want to see evidence that somehow in the historical record, a work like Tristan was interpreted in such a way, in this sort of political way. And I think the fact that Tristan, above all, more than any of the operas, with the exception of Parsifal, was the one that sort of everyone felt as though sort of they had a claim to, in sort of all of these kind of manifestations of Wagnerism in all different countries and all different sort of points in history. Just Tristan comes up over and over again, and film history as well. And it's hard to kind of see a political through line, in terms of how Tristan was interpreted. So I think, as an intellectual proposition, it can be compelling to articulate such an idea of the political Tristan, but I think it's sort of political interpretation there's not much to sort of build on, in terms of sort of the real world impact. It's sort of just on as sort of a political, very much, I think, in contrast to The Ring and Meistersinger, and as political as Meistersinger is, it's The Ring that has really been freighted with the political interpretations, left, middle, and right. But it's just a work that people always want to sort of allegorize and sort of apply allegorically to a contemporary political situation. With Tristan, I just don't see that happening so much. And so we just have to be careful with sort of the extraordinarily well-concealed message to when you're speaking historically, at least, not in terms of sort of contemporary interpretation, but when you're looking for sort of a historical evidence of such a political impact, the message might be actually sort of too well concealed to actually yield any visible impact.
So yes, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it sort of intersects with your point about which aspects of Wagner people were engaging with, because I think especially in relation to Tristan, the music itself is not the sort of where the politics is, and you need to do a lot of reading of the libretto, which I think a lot of people that are engaging with Wagner might not even necessarily do, which makes it a bit less relevant of an avenue of exploration.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a politics, there's a politics to Tristan, which is about, I think, gender and sexuality. And that is very strong, and sort of this nature of this complete capitulation, especially of the female, the sort of self-willed death of Isolde at the end of the opera in order to sort of join her beloved in whatever kind of alternate universe, is something that we've seen before, in Wagner several times, but it happens there in such an intense way that you feel as though it helped to shape kind of conceptions of gender roles and sort of imaginings of sort of roles in sexuality in a way that can be quite nasty and misogynist. But at the same time, there's the other side of it. There's the fact that Isolde was this powerful female who sort of could serve as a model to feminists and to sort of strong, independently minded women, along with Hilda, along with Kundry, to some extent. There's sort of the other side of that in terms of the gender politics, sexual politics of Tristan.
Right. Well, in the interests of not exhausting Alex even more than we perhaps already, or that I frankly already have, and we should probably draw this session to a close. Alex writes at one point in his book that writing this book has been the great education of my life. I think that for many of us, reading it will be the great education of ours. We will get a really good handle on what Wagner has meant to so many people, how those strands of meaning are still alive and perhaps available to us today as we continue to engage with music that fascinates, that occasionally repels. We engage with a man who is clearly a big part of our lives, since we're all members of the Wagner Society in New South Wales. Alex, I'd like to thank you again, personally on my behalf and on behalf of everyone, for giving of your time and also for writing this compendious book that we will all enjoy for years to come. If people feel appropriately, if you can record your applause with reactions, or indeed unmute yourselves and applaud live. Thank you, Alex.
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it deeply.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
And, I hope to see you all in person someday.
Well, as president, on behalf of the society and everybody that tuned in today, Alex and David, thank you so much. It was fascinating. If I could have one more request, if everybody could have their cameras on, so that we could maybe record a kind of a picture postcard of the team, and then we'll call it a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Liz, you tell me when you've done.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
You got a picture?
Yeah, I got a picture.
Fantastic. All right, everybody. Thank you, and see you next time.
Quite extraordinary. Yes.